Hello and welcome back to Scrap Mechanic. Before I get too into this here, this video gets a little technical. If you don't care much for logic and binary, then this one might not be for you. I do have a video on making an explosive railgun coming soon though, so subscribe if you want to see that. I'm doing this video just because I personally want to. I've had the idea for a while to make some logic creations for a video, but I wasn't sure how entertaining it would be to watch someone run back and forth with a connection tool. Because of that, I've also had the idea for a while to make some mechanical logic, because I think that would be more visually interesting and easier to see what was going on. So when I saw this comment that mentions a binary calculator, I figured that this was a great opportunity to make some mechanical logic. So in this video, I will be making a simple 4-bit binary adder, but using only mechanical gates. By the way, I read nearly every comment, so if you have an idea or suggestion for my videos, put them in the comments so that I can see. Also, let me know if a logic creation is something you want to see. I've never done anything like it before, but I think it could be fun. Anyway, let's get started. I'll explain what each gate does as I build them, but for reference, here's the diagram for the full binary adder. The left side are your inputs, while the right side are your outputs. In a circuit like this, each input and output can either be on or off, and each is called a bit. Each icon is a logic gate, and the circuit uses these to take the inputs and output the sum. 4 of these together, where C out of one goes into C in of the next, makes the 4-bit adder. To recreate this in game, I wanted to start by confirming it worked with the built-in logic gates. I put down some gates, connected them according to the diagram, and tested it. Light blue is the sum output, and light green is the carry output. You can see that if any of these inputs is on alone, the sum turns on, indicating the output is a 1. If any 2 inputs are on, carry turns on, indicating the output is a 2, and if all 3 are on, both the sum and carry turn on, indicating the output is a 3. This is a single full adder. I also then compacted this to make sure they could all be chained together, which they could, so I moved on to building each of these gates mechanically. Looking at the diagram, I knew that I needed an XOR gate, an AND gate, and an OR gate. I figured that the easiest of these to make would be the OR, so that's where I started. I placed down a large concrete slab to act as a base to build on. The way I wanted these gates to work was by having each input and output be a sliding pin. The pin would push different mechanisms inside the gate to either cause the output to extend or not. After thinking about it, I realized that Scrap Mechanic doesn't really have a sliding joint, but this suspension is pretty close. So I placed down 2 pieces of suspension and put rods on them to slide. I also decided to build the moving parts out of the brick block so you can see what's going on. I had an idea of how I wanted this gate to work, so I placed down a rotating arm and hit the suspension with my hammer to make sure it rotated. I eventually replaced this with another piece of suspension, but otherwise it worked, so I moved on to the next part. You can see here that as I hit each arm, it actuates the internals and pushes the output arm. This is exactly what I need, but you may also notice that the suspension keeps pushing back and is much stronger than my hammer. I tried to fix this by lowering the suspension strength to 0 and even switching the moving parts out for mesh block because of its extremely low friction. This only made it worse somehow, and now it wasn't even moving at all. I think this was just Scrap Mechanic physics again, because sometimes touching objects suddenly have extremely high friction, but it also meant that doing the gates this way would be inconsistent and frustrating. Working around the weird physics in this game is just becoming a recurring theme. I wanted to try to make this as authentic to mechanical logic as I could, but at this point, for consistency, I decided that instead of using pins that go all the way through, I would use sensors and pistons instead. All of the logic is still being done mechanically, and the only time I use the connection tool is to connect the pistons and sensors, but it does lose a bit of the authenticity this way. I just figured it was probably worth it if it made it more consistent in the end. Anyway, with excuses aside, I set to getting it to work this way. I wanted the gates to be consistent sizes so they were hot swappable, so I started by using a 7x7 tile square. With my 2 pistons in place, I put down another suspension for the output and placed blocks on it so it would be pushed by either piston. This actually completes the OR gate, a pretty simple one overall. An OR gate is pretty easy to explain this way. If the right input is on, in this case the sensor is triggered, the output is on. The pin gets pushed out of the gate. If the left input is on, the output is also on. In other words, if the left or right are on, so is the output. With that working, I saved it on my lift and moved on to the XOR gate, because similarly, I already had an idea of how I wanted this one to be done. I started by duplicating the first gate and placing it down a bearing for another rotating arm. The idea is that each piston will rotate this arm left or right, but if both pistons are on, the arm is centered. I also at this point decided that 7x7 wasn't long enough, so I expanded this one slightly and went back to change the OR gate later. I placed a suspension down just like the OR gate to act as the output pin and built a Y-shaped arm on it. The idea is that, with a block at either end, this arm will only be pushed forward if the rotating bar is angled. And again, that's actually the whole gate and I can explain it. An XOR gate is just like an OR gate, but the X stands for exclusive. That means the output is on if the left or the right input is on, but not both. Now the final gate I needed for this project, the AND gate. This one I thought would be the easiest one, but actually ended up being the most difficult by far. I wanted to do this whole project without having to look anything up, so I tried many times to get a working AND gate. Here's a time lapse of me trying. Yeah, I didn't do much. I couldn't really think of anything, and it was pretty obvious in my head what was and wasn't going to work, so there isn't much to see. I was thinking about a lot though. I finally gave in and just looked it up, and I was trying to find an online design that didn't rely on rotating pieces, because in Scrap Mechanic that can be incredibly glitchy, but I didn't see one. My worry here was actually justified in the final design, because this is the least consistent part, but it works about 75% of the time, so it was good enough for me. You can see that if both inputs are on, so is the output. If either input is on alone, the output is off. That's the definition of an AND gate. If left and right are on, so is the output. I actually realized looking at the footage again that there's a gap between the blocks inside, and if I'd filled that, it would have solved almost all of the inconsistency issues I had with this, but I didn't think about it at the time, and here we are. Anyway, with all of the components done, I can show off how these logic gates connect and finally start assembling the adder. To do this, I start off by making another big concrete slab and placing down where I want my inputs to be. I then proceed by placing down and chaining together one gate at a time, starting with the first XOR gate. I put this gate in a decent location and began to connect it up. In order to connect each piece of this adder, I'm building long lines of blocks that will be actuated in order to trigger each sensor it needs to. This ends up looking really cool and is very similar to how tracers are drawn on a PCB. The first gate is actually pretty simple, it just connects to the main two inputs. The second one I place is actually the wrong gate, it's supposed to be an AND gate, but I end up fixing that later. This one also connects to the main two inputs, and this is when I had to start working in 3 dimensions with my traces. Because these two gates share the same inputs, they had to cross somehow. This one was pretty simple to solve, and overall it didn't end up being too difficult, but in the end I probably spent half an hour just tracking down interfering lines. The next gate was a second XOR. This one had to have an input on one side and the output of the first XOR on the other. It was still pretty simple at this point, so I drew blocks to connect these 2 points. I did second guess my connections a couple times, but I was right on the first try. The 4th out of 5 gates was an AND that takes the same inputs as the previous one, so I just decided to expand those over and move on. I did have to go underneath to avoid interference, but it worked out okay. The final gate tab was an OR, with the 2 AND gates as inputs. The output of this one represents the output carry bit. And you come across to there. I did some testing and everything worked just as it did in the logic block, so I went ahead and moved on. At this point, I decided to color coordinate the lines as well, which I actually think really helped show what was happening, so I'm glad I did that. After the full adder worked, I went ahead and attached 4 of them together. I did 2 at a time, starting by welding one onto the other. The only logical connection that needed to be made between the two was to run the output of one carry bit into the input of the other. After I had this, and again confirmed it was working, I did the same thing again with another set of 2 to get my final 4-bit adder. Next I made some more traces of blocks to run into some pistons for input. The idea was that you flip a switch for the piston and it triggers the main adder. I wanted to centralize the input just to make it easier to use and understand. I actually spent the next couple hours moving the inputs around, deciding how I wanted to display the output, testing, troubleshooting, painting, and more, but it was pretty much completed at this point. I ended up running the output into a color-coordinated board with the inputs directly next to it. If you see the logic blocks here, those are just randomizing the inputs so that you can see the overall mechanism working without having to press any buttons. Those are effectively just for the video and have nothing to do with the final creation. Although it's an objectively small part, this logic alone took me a long time just to get working for the video. You can actually see it being actuated in the background now, using those logic blocks. I finished my testing by generating some random numbers with Google and putting them into the machine. Now, the input and output of this isn't binary, but I'll show some graphics on the screen here so you can see what's going on without having to explain too much binary. If the output pin is extended, that bit is on, otherwise it's off. For every pin that is on, you add the number on screen to get the final product. The same system works for the inputs. 4 plus 14. 1, 2, 4 plus 14, which is 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, so 4 plus 14 should be 18. But yeah, it didn't work the first try, so I went back and did some more troubleshooting, but from then on it worked. I also think it's super neat that because the mechanism takes time to move, you can see the output as it calculates large numbers. I'll let some of that run in the background while I do my outro. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in another video like this, or you just want to see more from me, you can click on the card or check out my channel. If you stuck around to the end of this video, congrats. I know it didn't end up being all that entertaining, but I appreciate your support. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.